Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
The reason why we would be monkeying around with viruses and trying to make them more lethal is in case somebody else does it. So we would know how to defend ourselves. Now, this is like the most patently bizarre sounding excuse. It's like if you were caught building a bomb in your house and the police were like, "What are you doing?" And you're like, "Well, I'm worried that someone's going to bomb me. So I need to explode bombs to figure out how to protect myself." I mean, it's like paranoid logic.
Right.
But at the national level.
Hello, and welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast here at the American Mind. Guess what? It's another two-hander. I'm your host, Spencer Clavin, associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books and features editor of the American Mind, and our various colleagues all have more important things to do, apparently, except Seth Barron. He never has anything more important to do. He's the managing editor of the American Mind. Seth, last time you and I did a two-hander, Putin immediately proceeded to invade Ukraine. So I'm taking bets now on what kind of global geopolitical disaster is going to ensue after we wrap on this one. Do you have any guesses?
I don't know, perhaps Argentina will invade Uruguay. Perhaps Brazil will invade Paraguay. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot that could happen.
That's true. This is the really encouraging thought that we always have to keep in front of mind, that there's all kinds of disasters that could unfold that haven't yet. So it can always get worse. For the time being, however, we're left with just our measly slate of present disasters, which is more than enough to be getting on with. Obviously, listeners will know that there's really no getting around to talking more about Ukraine and Russia, as always, trying to come at it from a slightly different angle than perhaps you're hearing about 24/7. And today we wanted to start with this really remarkable call for Tucker Carlson and other supposed Russian stooges to be treated effectively as treasonous. The most astonishing example of this, or maybe the most viral, let's say, example of this is this woman, Alexandra Chalupa. Chalupa tweets, "Tucker Carlson needs to be tried at The Hague as a disinformation agent in Putin's war. Carlson is a war criminal aiding and abetting a hostile enemy of the U.S., while thousands of American veterans are risking their lives helping Ukraine defend the free world." From Putin, that comes along with, I think, on The View, we had a call for Putin to be, or for Carlson to be treated as treasonous. Seth, you can remind me which senator it was who said that this was almost a treasonous thing for him to be doing, to be considering the various pros and cons of intervention. And we've got, just a number of, I think Whoopi Goldberg said something like, they used to arrest people for this. Now, Carlson, I've not been watching all of Carlson. I've seen some clips in which he kind of, in my view, like crossed the line in the sense of like he sort of went overboard on the contrarian take that, really just how bad is Putin. I'm sort of a well-known, like, Putin is actually pretty bad guy. So it's really beside the point, though. I mean, Carlson may or may not be right. I disagree with him. That's fine. It's kind of amazing, though, that the Democrat Party is like one step away from endorsing a return of the Alien and Sedition Acts. I mean, is this should we be taking this seriously? Is this just idiots talking on Twitter, or both?
I think it was Mitt Romney who said something about, Mitt Romney said that it's almost treasonous, what Tulsi Gabbard has said. Her treasonous lies,
right, she's the other one, Tulsi Gabbard.
Her treasonous lies may well cost lives. And yeah, I think they've said this on The View. Here's the funny thing is, ever since Trump was in office, Andrea Chalupa, the people on The View, Sarah Kendzior, and all of Andrea Chalupa's other friends, all of whom are just, these, well, she actually is some kind of expert on Ukraine or, whatever. But they've all been saying the same stuff about Tucker Carlson and treason.
Yeah.
What's interesting is we're not at war with Russia. Russia may have invaded Ukraine. It may be a war. It may be criminal in some, international legal sense. He may be committing war crimes, but he's not committing them against the United States. There's no way in which you can argue that we are at war with Russia. And that being so, I don't see how anything that anyone says about Russia could be treason. Furthermore, Lee Smith had a really good piece in Tablet this week about the Ukraine thing. And he kind of starts off, this wasn't the point of his article, but he starts off saying, like, just taking it as a major premise, just as a given, that the invasion of Ukraine was green-lighted by Biden. Which, is obvious if you're not just choking on propaganda. But before the invasion happened, Biden said, oh, we wouldn't consider it an invasion if he just takes those provinces. Yeah. Now, to go back to ancient history, the same thing happened in 1990 when the United States indicated to Saddam Hussein that an invasion of Kuwait would be seen as a regional conflict that didn't really involve the United States. There's a long history of the United States kind of, giving a wink and a nod to people to invade places. I mean, we've certainly okayed all kinds of invasions that didn't result in our involvement. But, like Indonesia invading East Timor, say. But it's interesting to think that, how else can you look at this? Biden said, we're not going to get involved. And then as the war keeps going on, Biden says, we're not going to provide air cover. We're not going to do a no-fly zone. We're not going to permit Polish planes to, supply, or, whatever that is with the Polish planes. We're not going to fly Polish planes in to resupply the Ukrainian Air Force. And every time he does that, the Russians increase their bombardments. Right. I'm not saying that Putin is taking orders from Biden, but probably Biden, I think they probably figured this would be over already. And it wouldn't matter and they could just move on.
So you think even both Biden and Putin thought that it would be easier and quicker for Putin to take Ukraine, and therefore it wouldn't be such a ongoing boondoggle?
Seems that way.
Yeah. Yeah, this is really fascinating. Zelensky is now here in front of, in front of Congress asking for this no-fly zone again, which, I personally can't really blame him for continuing to ask this. But as you say, Biden's been remarkably actually consistent about this. And we, in addition to sort of projecting our general decadence and weakness, we have also effectively, there's a limited number of options here, and we have effectively demonstrated an unwillingness, rightly or wrongly. I think probably rightly, we've demonstrated an unwillingness to go to war over this, and that was kind of Codavilla's point about NATO in general. Ukraine obviously not in NATO, but the general argument is unless you're willing. You're definitely willing 100% of the time to go to war over a small Baltic state. Don't commit yourself to it. Treat these situations as they come. But in fact, the option that we seem to have adopted is what you were indicating earlier, which is that we're gonna basically let this happen. We're gonna Biden's basically, as you say, gonna give a nod to it. And at the same time, we're going to enter into a sort of psychological and philosophical state as if we were at war. Like we're going to start talking on social media and in our government press releases and just in our public rhetoric generally as if the United States were in an actual military conflict with Russia. And there's this crazy elision or slippage that happens where, where it's the new world, it's modernity, it's the 21st century, and therefore, economic partnerships, economic republics and interactions all kind of replace belligerence, replace physical combat. So you can, sanction people into oblivion as a kind of act of like quasi-war. And then when somebody is actually engaged in a physical act of literal war, that is Putin, doing an actual invasion, we then respond as if like we were still in that same universe of like, well, the strongest thing is our economic leverage, and we're going to sanction you, and that sanction is tantamount to war, and therefore objections or concerns about actual war are treason. It's a strange, phenomenon that continues to accelerate, where the imaginary rhetoric of like our online kind of the online video game that we were playing about the news replaces our sense of what's actually going on in reality and in the actual news.
Yeah. It's a weird kind of compensatory mechanism, I guess. Well, we're not actually going to step in and do anything, but at the same time, we're going to like turn the knob of our outrage like past 11.
Right.
And we're going to cheer on the deaths of civilians like marching at tanks and hitting them with sticks. I saw some dope on Twitter wrote something, I guess he thought was right. He's like, note to Ukrainian citizens, if you throw a balloon filled with paint at a tank's periscope, that's just as effective at disabling it as like a $500,000 javelin missile. It's like, okay, buddy, why don't you go and stand in front of a tank and throw paint at it? I mean, look, it's insane. But these people like Chalupa and a lot of leftists, I mean, they're really excited. They really want to go to war. They really want like a hot war. They think that we should be parachuting in there and doing everything we can, short of nuclear weapons, and maybe those two, to eliminate Putin. I mean, I saw somebody today saying like Russia. Well, they were discussing the Brittany Griner case. I don't know how up on this everybody is, but the WN
probably update people. Yeah.
Well, this WNBA basketball player. I mean, I guess she's one of the best women basketball players. She plays for a Russian team, and she was arrested a few weeks ago for transporting hashish oil. And there's all these people trying to make a very big deal out of it, calling her like basically a political prisoner, demanding that, like saying, look, if Tom Brady were being held by Russia, people would be really mad, but because she's a queer black woman, nobody cares. It's not really clear what we're supposed to do. But so someone was saying like Russia is the worst country in the world for LGBT people, which is why this whole story doesn't make any sense, because she wouldn't. I mean, that argument doesn't make sense. But the idea that Russia may be not so nice to like gay activists, but I'm sure Uganda, Iran, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia are much worse countries for the LGBTQ community. So, just this is what I mean, this ramping up on the far left of this hostility, this belligerence. I mean, I think that they really see it as like anyone who doesn't want to go and die in front of like a Russian tank is just like lily-livered, coward, a traitor.
Right.
Though I don't see anybody, any of these people going and doing anything about it.
Yeah, well, we ran that piece on the site a while back. I think it was called the Putin variant, observing what I think is almost inarguable, which is that this fervor which you're describing is in some sense a kind of newer, better, updated version of COVID mania. And it has the kind of extra added zest of being new and being involving the military. And so, you can kind of get some conservative ink types on board with it. But it does just replace this all-consuming, right? This is the issue that we care about, and this, there are good guys and bad guys now reified in Ukraine versus Russia. And if you are even remotely deviant from supporting the good guys all the way in every capacity and with all your resources, including your own life, then you are anathema and you're to be exiled. And I think there are all sorts of like psychological explanations that you could give for this about, people's need to think in religious ways. I think it's pretty sacral and sacramental, but also just that it's a means of control, and it's a means of sort of shaming people into getting behind your political program. But this is what I've been wondering is like, is this just sort of how American politics functions, or have we all been driven mad by the internet? Like, I feel like I'm not old enough to know whether we simply go through these kind of mass hysterias from time to time, or whether it's just, the internet and the kind of weird hyper secular age that we're in has made us vulnerable to this thing where it is amazing how quickly, it's like the "I support the current thing" meme. It turns into, we've just replaced one obsession with another.
It is remarkable. I think that the internet certainly compresses and amplifies it.
Yeah.
Boosts the signal, as it were. I mean, I remember we were talking on the podcast maybe 6 months ago, and we were talking about masks. And I think I made the point that, like, all right, they've gotten millions of people into this paranoid frenzy about masks. And the problem is when they decide to turn it off, where's all that energy going to go?
Right. Yeah, totally.
And so what we see where some of it's going.
Never finding out the answer.
But what's funny is you would think that, and I kind of feel like, okay, it started out with Trump. Yeah. And Trump turned into, Russiagate, and then it sort of transmogrified into other things, and then COVID and masks, and now it's Ukraine. But it seems to, instead of attenuating, which is what you expect things to do,
right?
It seems to be intensifying, which is kind of frightening, right? Yeah. Because, well, what's after that? I don't really get it, but it does seem like this is all. Ultimately, doesn't all of this feel like it's about Trump?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I mean, it's all kind of the two narratives that are traveling on completely parallel tracks basically have to do with whether you think that Donald Trump was a flawed but necessary agent of serious, revision about how the regime has been run in this country for these many decades, or whether Donald Trump was himself a kind of Russian agent that was sent by Putin to destabilize our democracy and transform. I mean, I saw something the other day, some article, Americans show that they love democracy in other countries. Like, your support for Ukraine is belied by your, countenancing of Donald Trump or whatever. And yeah, obviously to both of us, like, that vision of the world is completely constructed disinformation based on nothing except just the rabid desire to destroy Donald Trump, and more importantly, as Trump himself pointed out, to shame and unperson anybody that thinks Trump had a point. Even just moderately, even with reservations. If you think that, then the real end game here is to define you out of polite society, out of enfranchisement, out of political influence and power. And I do think that there is another dimension of this, which is that if your rhetoric is and your hysteria is at an 11 or ratcheted up just further and further, like you're saying, but it never corresponds to any actual war or indeed any actual engagement with the reality of the world, there's going to be a natural place to point all of that energy eventually, and it's at the kind of mimetic object of scapegoating, which is namely Trump supporters and deplorables, like all of this stuff that you're gonna be economically sanctioned, and you're gonna be shamed, and we're not gonna do business with you. Like that just seems like all kind of less and less about what's actually going to positively affect the war in Ukraine, and more about like developing a kind of attitude that we have toward undesirables that we will eventually just turn on Trump supporters.
There is something very Girardian about the entire dynamic, including the whole idea that substitution does not lead to attenuation, but actually a kind of intensification.
Yeah, it escalates, totally.
Yeah, it escalates. And that is the weird part. I mean, and another aspect to this is, I mean, it was Trump's conversation with Zelensky that resulted in his impeachment, which didn't make any sense. I think nobody paid any attention to it because it came after the Mueller report resulted in nothing. It was like a weird sort of attempt to stick it to him anyway. But then the way in which Ukraine has figured as this obsessive focus for so many years, and it's where Hunter Biden was making all of this, dirty money. It's where Joe Biden was tasked as Obama's representative, where he went and told them. I mean, it's so overdetermined is my point here.
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody is able to explain exactly how all of this works, that Joe Biden was like the emissary to go and handle Ukraine, that while he was there, he blackmailed the Ukrainians to fire a prosecutor who was investigating his son's company, that Trump asked Zelensky about it and was impeached. Nothing about this makes, and now we're having a war over Ukraine. I mean, I guess it's a very, Ukraine is some kind of jewel in the crown for some God knows what reason. I guess it has a lot of resources. It's strategically important. It's kind of like a great game type of situation.
Yeah, I think it's very resource rich. Just as if it's on your risk board, that's why Putin wants it.
Okay, so but it's really crazy. That's all I want to say. I mean, this is just absolutely crazy.
Well,
I guess everybody knows
that. Everybody with eyes to see. I mean, have you seen this like developing Twitter meme, or rather leftist talking point, that when the impeachment happened over that phone call, that was just an example of the great Volodymyr Zelensky standing in the way, the lone man standing in the way of America and a descent into sort of banana republic autocracy, because Trump was trying to get him to investigate political opponents, but he wouldn't back down. And this freedom fighter thing has now also been transposed retroactively into the impeachment stuff. And this is the part of things that when you start talking about it, you immediately become a Russian stooge. And it feeds into our next topic, which we did just want to touch on, which is this whole thing about biolabs, right? And again, speaking as somebody who repeatedly, I guess, has said on this podcast, all of America's proxies and allies are flawed, and indeed many of America's own interactions with those proxies and allies have been, flawed or involved realpolitik, and, you have to make hard choices. All of these things can be true. Like, I still sort of know which side of this I'm on vaguely, although I don't really want us to go to war over it. But you start asking the kinds of questions that you're asking, Seth, and suddenly it's like, well, do you inadequately support the grand and glorious state of Ukraine? It's like, it's not a grand. It's an admirable. It's a state that's currently mounting an admirable resistance against what looks like a terrible assault by a bad guy. But now we have this stuff that has become, it's one of these, like, it's a conspiracy theory until it's not. And then when it's not a conspiracy theory, it's not happening, but it's good that it is. Victoria Nuland, who's a State Department official, I guess testified before Congress that, this is her quote, Ukraine has biological research facilities, which in fact we are now quite concerned Russian troops, Russian forces may be seeking to gain control of. I mean, Seth, maybe you can explain this to me a little bit. It seems to me that this is something that people like Glenn Greenwald and indeed Carlson were like pointing out, and some of them, like in Carlson's case, using it as a point in favor of like Ukraine's not all that great, and also America has sort of its hands dirty in this state, and this was like, you're a conspiracy theorist. This doesn't exist. You're a stooge. You're in fact treasonous. But then when Nuland basically admitted that this was sort of true, then it became, well, they're not weapons facilities. They're just facilities that could be used to create biological weapons. Which, I don't know, seems to me like splitting hairs. What is the significance of this besides just like that people are sort of telling us not to believe our lying eyes?
Well, I mean, let's just back up for a second and remember who Victoria Nuland is.
Oh,
I mean, I'm not utterly familiar with her entire career, but I mean, this was one of the architects of the Gulf War. Like, she worked for Cheney and Bush. So, I mean, when you're talking about the swamp,
right?
I mean, I think Tucker Carlson was saying, like, this is the woman who engineered the Iraq War, and she did not go to jail. She didn't lose her job. She's been promoted. I mean, he was saying she's likely to be Secretary of State one day, which seems likely. And this business with the biolabs is entirely bizarre. I mean, it reminds me quite a bit of when we heard about the biolabs in Wuhan.
Right.
Oh, so now it seems that the United States, the rumors that there's level 4 biohazard labs in Wuhan that work on bat viruses.
Surprise, right?
Surprise.
So
bat viruses, yes, but then, that's just an insane conspiracy theory. You will be banned from Twitter for mentioning it. That is insane. Nobody, and then, lo and behold, it turns out, yes, there are level 4, but they don't work on gain of research, as Fauci said. They do work on gain of research, but only on the old definition of gain of research. It turns out what we're doing there, we're not trying to, the reason why we would be monkeying around with viruses and trying to make them more lethal is in case somebody else does it. So we would know how to defend ourselves. Now, this is like the most patently bizarre sounding excuse. It's like if you were caught building a bomb in your house and the police were like, "What are you doing?" And you're like, "Well, I'm worried that someone's going to bomb me. So I need to explode bombs to figure out how to protect myself." I mean, it's like paranoid logic.
Right.
But at the national level. And now, and that's exactly what Victoria Nuland said about these biolabs. It's like, well, we know that Russia wants to attack Ukraine with bioweapons. So we need to have these labs there to investigate bioweapons to make sure that we can defend ourselves against them.
Yeah.
And Marco Rubio said, but we would know for sure that if there was a bio attack, it would come from Russia. And she's like, yes, it's characteristic of Russia to blame other people for what they're doing, which is exactly what describes precisely what she just said. So said about what we're doing. Look, I think there's so much fog of war going on here. I mean, every day, either Ukraine is about to fall, or they just wiped out 30,000 generals, right. Russian generals. So, I don't really know what's happening.
This is one area where it's just impossible to figure out what's true. I mean, on the origin of COVID, this stuff, I'm reading a book about this right now. It's called Viral. And it's by this woman, Alina Chan, who's a scientist, and then she's got a co-author who's like a science writer. And what's kind of amazing about it is that there is also there's kind of a lot of complexity, it seems, to the question whether, there's the question whether it leaked from a lab, and then there's the question whether in the lab what they were doing with it is trying to make it more infectious and, adding this furin cleavage site and whatever, yada, yada. And my money is on that it did in fact leak from a lab, but what do I know? The interesting thing to me about the book and about the whole question is that you have these two very sober professional analysts who are not Trumpsters or whatever. They're just kind of plotting to try and get to the truth. And in order to do this, they had to be arguing with basically posters on Twitter, because those were the only people that were actually looking into the issue. And then everybody else was either the Chinese government deleting files off of their databases so that you couldn't see the similarity between the bat virus and the person virus, or they were American officials who were practically no better and doing exactly this thing where this is an outrageous conspiracy theory, and then oops, it turns out very, very plausible. Seems like the evidence supports at least the possibility that this is a lab leak. And I get the same impression here. It's as you say, right? What exactly is the point of having, biolabs in Ukraine unless you feel there's some kind of defense or, there's some kind of military interest in having them? It is hard for me to imagine why you would do that unless that was the point. And so to raise that issue, if I raised that issue and somebody said, well, here's the explanation for this, this, and this, and there's really no problem there. And I would be like, well, I don't know. I don't know that much about this stuff. I'll happily hear you explain that. But when you raise the issue and it's you suck, you are basically Satan for having asked that question. And how could you be so treasonous as to suggest that the U.S. might be less than above board about its interests with biochemical engineering in Ukraine? Then suddenly it's now I'm suspicious. I wasn't suspicious before, but when people who, as you say, have basically been, up in this game for decades start talking in this shifty way about it, it does give people, if you want to make people develop conspiracy theories, this seems like the way to go about it, is to just lie to them and then shame them for raising questions.
Well, especially because this is how they tricked us into the Iraq war by vowing absolute 100% proof that Saddam Hussein was developing bio warfare, that there was no doubt that we and that's why we had to go in and kick him out. And this is basically came out of Victoria Nuland's shop, from what I gather, or close to it. So are they running the same playbook? I don't know. It's a little dispiriting.
Yeah, no, it is dispiriting, and it's it doesn't strike me as the sort of thing that changes my opinion about the Ukraine-Russia conflict so much as something that deepens my antipathy toward the American ruling class. So much about this is much more about sort of like you were saying with Trump earlier. A lot of this is so much more about our total distrust of our leaders and their total failure to earn our trust in any way, that it's almost you start to get into this position where whatever they say, you say the opposite, right? Whatever the current thing is, like that's the opposite of what I'm going to do, which is also not particularly helpful, but very understandable that people are like, well, if if these folks just keep lying to us over and over again, and it's like it's like Linus with and Lucy with the football, it's like eventually you're an idiot if you keep running for this punt and knowing she's going to pull the ball away.
I feel like they're kind of duping us in this other way, which is they're lulling us into this false sense that, well, we're not getting involved in this. They keep saying, we're not going to do this. We're not going to send troops. We're not going to do a no-fly zone, no boots on the ground. And so, even I feel confident. I'm like, okay, well, at least there's that. But then I just feel like, oh, well, they're just saying that in order to sucker punch us and say we weren't going to go to war. We've been very, very clear about that. But now that X has happened, we have no choice, and we must commit ourselves to deposing Vladimir Putin and restoring democracy. Whatever. I at this point, I'm kind of thinking like there's maybe a 30% chance that that's where we're headed. That one of these days, I don't know, maybe like a bullet will hit a Polish farm barn and they'll determine that it was fired from a Russian gun and that's the new cause of war, or something will happen. Someone will murder Zelensky's wife, and just the outrage of that, whatever it is, they'll come up with some excuse for why, yes, we've had a lot of forbearance, but now they've crossed the Rubicon, and now we have to go to war.
Yeah, this is my sort of less sophisticated version of this idea is that whenever Biden definitively looks into a camera and makes a proclamation that something definitely is or definitely is not going to happen, like the opposite of what he says is what's about to occur. Like this is, all of his major campaign promises. We're not going to shut down the country. We're going to shut down the virus, right? Like, 5 minutes later, you've got a vaccine mandate and whatever. This is sort of how his presidency tends to work. So I'd say it's a fair bet that because he says we're not going to war, like that, there's a decent chance that actually we will. Like, and as you say, like there's a kind of theater to it of don't make me. Oh, I'm resisting. But in fact, it turns out that we just have to. And I mean, even leaving that aside, it does sort of seem as if we are already committed as like as a policy point to crippling not simply Vladimir Putin but the Russian people. Like all of this kind of peripheral fervor that's coming on about we're not going to do our concert with Tchaikovsky, we're not going to teach Dostoevsky, whatever. This sort of cancel Russia culture is kind of on the periphery of a much more serious policy idea, which seems to be like not only is Putin a really bad guy and not only is this an unjust invasion, but also like actual Russian people just suck and like Russian culture sucks and Russia is our inveterate enemy, which just seems incredibly nearsighted to me. Like of all the countries to be categorically excluding from our horizon of like potential future allies or neutral partners, like Russia, it seems like a bad idea, especially when you've got China right next door.
Yeah. There's been some talk like, oh, this is like a return to the 80s when everybody hated Russia. But here's the thing. Back in the 80s and during the Cold War, even like your most hardcore militant anti-Soviet people were never saying that there was something wrong with Russians and Russian culture. There was always the assumption that there was a basic friendship between people and an admiration for Russian culture. The idea was that the Soviets, the Bolsheviks, had imposed this like demented, inhuman system atop of them, and that they were suffering. Right. But now the idea is like, no, the Russian people themselves are complicit with Putin. So we need to, right. I mean, should we ban Nabokov? I guess.
Well,
I don't know.
totally. I mean, Nabokov, we should actually consider banning Nabokov, I think, but that's a separate question. For not because he's Russian. I mean, Julia Loffa, that journalist. I forget where she's at, New York Times or somewhere. She's sort of constantly tweeting bad takes, but she sort of eagerly retweeted this interview with a guy who's saying, this is just the way that Russia is. They have these dictators and they have these strong men. Putin's not an anomaly. And yeah, like it seems as if like Russophobia has actually become the one acceptable attitude. The one acceptable prejudice to have is that like the Russian people themselves are bad, which speaks again to the Girardian thing. It speaks to this being more about like a kind of psychodrama about good and evil and purity than it is about reality. But I mean, literally, Facebook is like relaxing its restrictions on calling for death as long as you're calling for death against Russians, like as long as you're a Ukrainian calling for death against Russians, I think is, which is probably where, I mean, we shouldn't, I guess, be surprised because we knew that all of these moral codes, according to which these tech companies run their business, were kind of contingent upon your being in the good camp or in the bad camp. But it's pretty striking to see it applied to like actual calls for death and acts of war.
Well, yeah, and that's very Girardian because Girard would say everyone who claims who hates someone believes that their cause is just.
Right.
It's the other ones that are wrong.
Right.
So,
you never know that you're the one doing the scapegoating.
Right. So, like someone who hates Black people or Jews, well, they're incorrect. That's why we ban them. But people who hate Russians are objectively correct. So, yeah, it's really bad.
Yeah,
it's really bad. We'll have to talk offline about Nabokov because I'm kind of a fan. But
no, I love Nabokov. I'm just kidding.
All right,
there's a really good and interesting. This may interest listeners actually. An article by Podhoretz in Commentary. It's called something like, if you just Google Podhoretz Nabokov commentary, in which he kind of reconsidered, because Podhoretz initially was this big like pro, all sorts of smut, like all porn, all debauchery should be fair game. And in this article, he sort of flirts with the idea of banning Nabokov in a really interesting way. But no, I think he's phenomenal. In any case, on this topic of the bad people don't have rights, it actually does segue nicely into our next and last segment, which is this kind of weird document that the Secret Service put out after this shooting. No, these terrible shootings where somebody went into a yoga studio called Hot Yoga, I think, and killed 2 women and injured several others, and then committed suicide, and just one of these really ugly, awful cases. But out of it arose this amazing document called it's this United States Secret Service presents Hot Yoga Tallahassee. This is online. You can just read it, and the subtitle is A Case Study of Misogynistic Extremism. And what's amazing is that this is a document like entirely about, it's using this one kid who was kind of an incel, an involuntary celibate, and who like posted a couple things about like Hitler. So he was kind of he's the perfect profile for them to just take his life and without any other evidence suggest that like being an incel online is automatically a red flag for mass shootings. Like they've got these little boxes about telling this kid's story. He failed to succeed in establishing a career. He was said, I guess actually he didn't even necessarily post this, but he was said to openly admire Hitler and the Aryan nations. He touched girls without their consent. I mean, this is like an actual, you talk about Girardian, like this is a portrait of, well, this person is this way, and therefore like all people within the incel class should be under like state surveillance. So I don't know. We want to talk about this a little bit. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Well, I guess here's what I don't understand, and maybe you can you're from a different generation.
Yeah.
I guess you're a millennial. I'm Gen X. Maybe you can explain something to me. incels are guys who like have trouble with women, right?
Yeah.
So, but is it that they have then adopted that as their personality? Like they are now saying, it seems like they call themselves incels, but it sounds like it's a voluntary descriptor. Like they're saying, I voluntarily am involuntarily celibate. Like, is the idea like, are they still trying to date women, or they're saying like, no woman will have me, life is unfair, I will start the incel revolution?
Yeah. So originally, this title is a sort of it's sort of applied from the outside in, or rather, that's not true. It was a Canadian woman who came up with this title for just people, right, that wanted to have sex but couldn't find a partner, and this was involuntary celibacy, and this makes you an incel. But like things do on the internet, it kind of veered out of the control of the person who invented it and became, yeah, a self-adopted descriptor. Like you claim the title incel or you lob it at somebody else. Either way, you're identifying this person as like somehow lower on the socio-sexual totem pole than they would like to be, than anybody would like to be. And there has evolved this like really fascinating kind of cultural philosophy around it, especially among like self-proclaimed incels, that like here society is so structured so that I cannot get a woman. Like here's why, and this is an immutable fact about the world. But it also is kind of adjacent to this whole like sort of manosphere thing of like actually you can game the system, and if you do this, this, and this, like it doesn't matter how ugly you are, you can kind of so like there are many different varieties, I guess is what I'm trying to say, and sub varieties of being an incel or being a volcel, which is like somebody who's rediscovered the ancient truth that if you control your sexual urges, you become more sort of like powerful and desirable. The whole thing strikes me as like, you know, a basically harmless and certainly um, and certainly kind of fascinating like internet subculture that has been turned into like this one thing. Like this is the lone wolf killer who resents women because he feels entitled to sex for them from them and is just likely to walk into a yoga studio and shoot it up. Like that's the exaggerated and worst case scenario version of this phenomenon. But more broadly speaking, I think it's just a way of talking about like all the different ways in which the dating sucks in general, and dating very much sucks in the days of the internet, and like our culture is so sexually commodified and so, you know, hyper and so shallow that like a lot of men are kind of finding themselves in this weird like nether region, and often they kind of wallow in self-pity about it.
There's on YouTube, you can look up, I don't know if anyone knows about this fellow, Alec Manazian. Have you heard of this guy? Alex
No.
Manazian. Okay, he was in Canada. He's the guy, he rented a U-Haul truck and then just ran over like 8 or 9 people and killed a whole bunch of them. Like he killed like 10 people.
Yeah.
And then he went in his, after he was arrested, he just freely confessed that, well, he's an incel and he had been in communication with the Supreme Gentleman, Elliot Rodger, another incel who had killed people in California. And Alec Manazian gives this, I mean, it's almost as though he read something online, like this whole kind of metaphorical fantasy about how the incels and the betas are going to rise up against the Chads and the Stacys and kill them. And then they will become, I mean, it's this very like adolescent fantasy of like primal violence.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where like you attain sexual dominion by like through murder, I guess, essentially, or like
Right.
like some mass revolt. I mean, it was insane. I mean, he's just like severely mentally ill.
Right. Well, this
and
is the yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
and a criminal. Yeah, I mean, so I can sort of sympathize with the Secret Service a little bit. I mean, Alec Manazian didn't seem like he was a racist. He was just a just hard up. Yeah, I mean, to me, I imagine the Secret Service. This is part of the whole domestic terror effort to make it seem as though like white people are essentially very dangerous.
Well, this is the thing, right? Is like, yeah, incel culture contains within it like rubrics for dividing the world into haves and have-nots, and more often than not, the haves and the have-nots are sort of born into their position, and there's no escaping from it. And of course, like this is a way of thinking that might potentially lend itself in the hands of a disturbed individual to violent fantasies, to manifestos about who needs to die, and to even acting on those violent fantasies. But like, you know, what's another such worldview is like BLM is like structural racism, and the idea that like whitey is keeping you down, you know, and there's no cure except to cleanse him, as we saw in Waukesha, right? And this is your great point, is like this is an idea that has basically disappeared into the ether. And so it does seem like for the State Department to kind of endorse the idea that like this kind of online fantasy and this kind alone is in danger of like generating domestic extremism, is to contribute to exactly the kind of situation in which people might feel like they're being persecuted and oppressed. You know what I'm saying? Like there's no document, there's no equivalent document about the danger of domestic extremism from like people that talk online about how white people are inherently guilty.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we all know that, you know, there's only one kind of hate is matters, right?
Right.
Like other kinds of hate are legitimate.
Well, producer Jake did bring to our attention the fact that in Germany they're like taking steps to just to disarm people on the basis of being too far right, essentially. Like, I think they've identified some 1,500 suspected extremists and tightening background checks for those wanting to acquire guns. This is the AP, which, like, you know, nothing wrong with making it impossible for actual bad actors to get guns, but it does also seem as if, like, the people who are being defined as bad actors are getting to be more and more just like sort of troubled folks who might be feeling a bit on the outs from modern American society, and to identify those people as fit targets of unpersoning rather than to ask, well, why is it exactly that so many young men feel so disaffected, and why is it that like the dating scene has become demoralizing for everybody? You know, I mean, you could also talk about like why women are feeling like they want to check out of this stuff as well. But I guess it's all just a tool to do what they want rather than actually related to reality in any way.
Right. I mean, look, there's always all kinds of reasons and root causes for anything, but the point is you're not supposed to go out and blame an entire group for the actions of one individual, which seems like what they're trying to do here.
Right. I mean, this is kind of the Girard episode of the Roundtable, it would seem. And I mean, do you just think that like Girard is sort of the scholar who gives the account of our times, or like I often, before this moment, I used to think that Girard was like too totalizing about how human relations work. Like he sort of has this mimetic theory, and it seems to explain everything, and yet it does seem to explain basically most of what we've talked about today.
Well, we've talked about this before. It does sort of explain a lot. I mean, yes, Girard. I mean, if you read Girard's book on Shakespeare, by the end of it, you're like, gee, I guess I don't really care. I don't really like Shakespeare anymore because every play is exactly the same.
It's just about how Rene Girard is right. Yeah.
Right. So, you know, you can maybe overdo it with Girard, or maybe he overdoes it, but it's a very useful device. It's a very useful tool. And I think particularly in moments such as this,
Right.
where there's so much crisis and society is so labile and things are so in flux, and there's so much hostility,
right,
that his thesis, I think, gains like more purchase than maybe it often would.
Yeah, it also, and I mean, not to hijack the last 5 minutes of this podcast with just like nerdy Girard talk, but I actually think that most of our listeners are pretty into Rene Girard, or like would like to read more of him. In any case, also a major part of the sort of Girardian analysis of human relations is that it describes the primitive state of man. It describes the sort of pre-gospel state that everybody is in without knowing it until the gospel comes along and sort of offers a new way of interacting and living. And that is another thing that we're currently, is currently very present to us, is for all of our so-called sophistication, we are kind of regressing to these atavistic basic impulses, having given up on on the Constitution and stuff. We're just sort of acting out our primitive Freudian fantasies.
Absolutely.
Well, that's probably all the Girard that one podcast audience can take. And we've now discussed a whole range of things, not all of which were Ukraine. So I count that as a success. And thank you, Seth, as always, for the two-hander. And thanks to you all for listening to the Roundtable. Always glad to have you with us. If you want to support our work, visit claremont.org/donate. And if you want to learn more about all our projects and writing, visit our websites at americanmind.org, claremont.org, claremontreviewofbooks.com, and our Washington, D.C. based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. Please rate, share, and subscribe at Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks to the production and engineering crew, Jake Gannon, Annalisa Lee, and Noah Peterson. And thank you all for listening. Talk to you next week.